Great. Welcome, everyone. My name is Claire Gaffney. If you don't know me, I am a second year, and my project is around human-sounding generative chatbots, strategic and ethical trade-offs. So today I'll talk a little bit about what my project is, a little bit about the genesis, and then I have three things that I want to talk about today. The strategic decisions that go into either designing a generative chatbot or evaluating potential chatbots, the design decisions that are impacted by those strategic decisions, and then the potential ethical trade-offs that go into both the strategic and design decisions that are being made. In the appendix, and this is more just to inspire interest if you want to look at my paper later, I have some thoughts on policy and regulation in this space, as well as a behavioral health use case. But to start, I'll talk a little bit about why my project. The genesis of this project, honestly started last summer. I read some interesting articles about the social, emotional, psychological impact on consumers who are engaging with generative chatbots. And I was kind of curious about the business side of that. Are companies thinking about that impact? And if so, what sort of framework should they be using to evaluate what that impact could be on consumers? So I think my project is a little bit different than the set of considerations or critiques that go into traditional kind of AI, things around climate change, biases in the data, stuff like that, which are still valid critiques, but I think this is a little bit of a different approach. And then second, there's a lot of interesting research around how engagement with digital entities, which are sometimes called emotional chatting machines or intelligent social agents, in fact, how engagement with those leaves users vulnerable. That opens the door for actors, intentionally or unintentionally, to take advantage of the people that are using those generative chatbots. So those are kind of the two kind of categories that my project covers. And then in terms of who is it for, the assumption that I kind of made as I was doing my research and talking to people is you are a business leader, you've decided to use a generative chatbot, either building a model, fine-tuning a model, using some sort of GPT that already exists, and how do you think about or how do you evaluate some of the design that goes into that? So that is where I started, and I'll talk about the strategic decisions. None of this is necessarily groundbreaking categorization. Business leaders should think about the purpose, the output, and the stakeholders involved when using a generative chatbot. In terms of the purpose, I think this has been covered in a lot of CDS presentations. I think the most important thing is a problem-first approach. Why is a generative chatbot better than a call center or another given kind of solution to a problem that you're looking at? And then, as a result, what is the value that is added either to your users or to your business? The purpose itself will then impact the design. So if the purpose is to upsell consumers for products, then that results in a very different design than building trust with a set of patients who can then be referred to a full-time psychologist, for example. In terms of output, again, this feels obvious, but this isn't always the case. Each business leader should be able to measure what they're solving for and measure what you are providing to users. So what does a positive interaction with a generative chatbot look like, and how do you measure that? And then finally, stakeholders. Not only should you look at and talk to the direct stakeholders that are using your generative chatbot, but you should also think about the indirect stakeholders. So a very easy example is if your generative chatbot, such as the one that Khan Academy has deployed, if your direct users are students, how is that also impacting teachers and parents and tutors? All of those people should be involved when you're thinking about design. And then this was an interesting one. If your user needs and your business goals conflict, how do you reconcile that? A lot of the experts that I talked to, interestingly, said that the only kind of condition is that the users need to be aware of that conflict. An example of kind of an analogous conflict is social media, where users are using social media for one given purpose, but the social media companies want engagement, they want advertising, and that doesn't always match up with what users are looking for. The same thing can happen with generative chatbots. So as long as users have an ability to exit and they're aware of that conflict, then that isn't necessarily a stopping point. And as I said, being intentional with these strategic decisions up front is very critical because they inform those design decisions that happen down the line. When I was looking at the design decisions, I defined kind of 5 important ones. Yeah, 5. The 5 most important ones. The first one is around tone. So this is like how language is translated to models. There's a really cool philosopher on campus who actually looks at the impact of translation and what is lost in the application of language models to like a computerized system. And an example of this is, say you're building a behavioral health generative chatbot. You want that generative chatbot to have some of the tendencies that a good therapist would have, such as reflective listening. But when you're encoding reflective listening into a generative chatbot, what is lost in that translation? So one example, reflective listening could be a good thing, but it could also mean that you're not challenging your user because you're just reflecting back what they're saying. So that is something that you need to be mindful of when you're thinking of the design that goes into a given generative chatbot. Kind of related to that is like whether or not you are building a sense of trust with your user. You need to be able to define whether trust is essential and if you are tailoring your chatbot to a given user. There's some interesting research that's been done around tailoring to different political leanings and the impact of providing misinformation based on that tailoring. That's one example of how you can tailor and whether you should or should not. And then importantly, you have to be able to decide like what you do if your user has too much trust in your application, which could mean a bunch of different things depending on the application, but maybe that is just some sort of intervention or reminder. The third piece here, situatedness, is kind of like an engineering computer science term, but the application here is basically a recognition of the context in which both the chatbot is developed, deployed, and used, as well as the context in which the user is engaging with it. And that could mean a lot of different things. That could mean some of the biases that are inherent to a given generative chatbot, but it could also mean how your chatbot is using direct or indirect language. A user could receive that very differently depending on where in the world they are. I was thinking back to like our managing people spectrum of like how different countries use direct language. Someone in Germany might be very direct, whereas someone in Mexico, for example, uses more indirect language. And how your generative chatbot is perceived might be very different, even if the way that you fine-tuned it is to one type of language. A fourth thing that came up a lot is visual reminders. Visual reminders of how you're not engaging with the human. So how can you design the user interface such that the person that is using it is reminded that they're not talking to a human, but they're talking to a non-human agent? Maybe that's creating an avatar that has a little robot. Maybe that's providing visual reminders throughout. There were also some interesting research around transparency disclosures, which is kind of what is being done right now, kind of upfront messages saying you are now engaging with a chatbot, not a real human. But there is some terms and conditions blindness, which is what happens a lot in this space. So all that to say, transparency disclosures are definitely not enough. And then finally, one of the biggest design decisions is the release valve. Like, what is the exit path for when a user wants to stop using your application, or if the reason that they came to your application isn't being met? And then where applicable, when should the release valve include a human? A good example is, an airline's chatbot where you're just trying to solve a simple problem. It's not being solved by the generative chatbot. How can you then engage an agent, a human agent? And interestingly, I talked to one executive whose perspective was that a generative chatbot application is often a core brand level experience. So all these design decisions are super important because if you provide a bad user experience, if you make users feel duped in the long run, then your application and potentially even your brand will be eroded in the long term. And then finally, I looked a little bit at ethical trade-offs. Obviously, there's a ton of ethical trade-offs that go into generative AI and technology in general, but the two that I focused on were transparency and auditing. Transparency, the trade-offs that go into how much to disclose to users about the strategic and design decisions made, and through what channel you should be making those disclosures. I think part of this is oftentimes the design of the model affects your ability to be transparent. If you're using a supervised or unsupervised model, sometimes you don't always know what all of the inputs and outputs are or where they're coming from. So that is something you should keep in mind if you need a really transparent application. And then kind of similarly, like how do you effectively inform users about the system they are using? A lot of generative chatbot applications on the market now kind of tout that their code is open source or you can see what they've done. But that isn't true transparency because most users don't know what any of that means or how to access it. So that is also not true transparency. Some could argue that's accountability, but in my view, that is not transparent enough. And then kind of related to the direct versus indirect language, the situatedness of the given application, how do you contextualize the answers that a given user is receiving so that they're taking it in the right way? And then on the right-hand side here around auditing, how should you audit the user to make sure that they're behaving as intended? That's kind of related to measuring positive impact, which you should be defining up front. But then what do you do if that does happen? There's a lot of simple ways to do that. Maybe it's just measuring the time spent in a given application, and if it's beyond the scope of what the time should spent be, then maybe there's an intervention. And then kind of on the flip side, how do you audit if your generative chatbot is behaving as intended? Do you do kind of like regular internal audits to look at keywords that are inappropriate? There's lots of different ways to do that, but that should be something that you should be thinking about. Importantly, and this kind of combines the first two questions there, does the relational model between a user and a chatbot remain at a healthy distance? And a healthy distance is kind of dependent on the application and the purpose. For a behavioral health chatbot, the healthy distance might be a little bit closer than a chatbot that is just helping you with your order from Amazon. And then finally, what are the reporting mechanisms for users? You need to be able to find if things go wrong and if you miss it through your internal auditing process, how can users report that the experience that they had was negative? And like I said, these are just a few of the ethical trade-offs, but these were the ones that I found most interesting in my research. And they're the ones that don't have a clear answer necessarily, but they should be defined by a given business leader who's interested in deploying a generative chatbot. So with that, I will open the floor to questions. Thank you. Lauren?
Have you found that business leaders are thinking about these things within this framework, or everybody's just trying to figure out how to get AI into their company and they're not really
It's from the people that I talk to, it's kind of a blend of both. I don't think there's a lot of structured thinking around this. I think a lot of business leaders want to do the right thing, but don't know how to think about it in the right way. And they're also trying to balance the speed to market element. For example, one academic that I talked to was developing this behavioral health generative chatbot. And his view was the ideal case for the development timeline would include the FDA, almost going through the clinical trials process because it's meeting a clinical need. But in his view, if they license that out to any commercial business, no commercial business is going to want to go through the clinical trials process. So there's an inherent tension there, which I think speaks to your question about speed versus thoughtfulness. So my goal was to at least introduce some structure. Jippy?
Can you talk a little bit about the impact and the importance of these considerations when you're across different use cases? Because I imagine doing customer support is very different from a medical or behavioral health application. And I'm even thinking, I know generative AI can do a lot more, but I feel it's been many years where you could have there's a chat and it'd be pretty standard responses and things like that. But I guess I'm just curious how you would frame some of this thinking across the spectrum of really, really personal and sensitive to kind of still transactional, and maybe things we've had like iterations of it in the past.
Yeah, I think in short, I think the kind of like three-prong framework up front to have the purpose defined, the output defined, and then kind of like the measurable parts defined is how you could apply it across different industries. But I totally agree that it looks totally different depending on the application, the users, even the intention of the business, which I think is what makes it tricky because it's a comparable application across all these different industries, but the impact is so different. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but all that to say, like that's kind of why I framed, at least in this presentation, some of this as more like questions than actual like answers that apply across industries. Anna?
Thank you, Claire. This was really insightful. I think one part of your design components is around like the release or exit valve or something and having a human in the loop. I was just curious, I can understand this might be application dependent, but like are there other aspects of the design process where a human in the loop is much more important? I mean, is that kind of, I'm just curious if you had insights on that rather than just at the very end,
Yeah, no, I agree. I think some of it, like you said, depends on the application. One person that I talked to, which I thought this was very insightful, when they were thinking about like the problem first, the problem that they were solving for was like 24/7 kind of call center availability. And the way that they kind of did their research is 40% of our call center engagements are positive and the rest are not. So how can we think about using this chatbot to like maybe augment, to have more positive interactions on the whole while still maintaining some of our call center abilities, which is like the human in the loop that might be engaged once a user is not having their problem solved. So all that to say, I don't know if this answers your question directly, but I think the human in the loop is when you want to augment or like create overall positive experiences, but it doesn't necessarily mean that all applications need a human in the loop. Yeah. And another example of a release valve for like ChatGPT is just closing the window.
Yeah, a big part of the debate around transparency is actually in the underlying training data. How do you think companies should balance the idea that releasing some of that data actually could cause harm to wherever that data came from, right? So in the case of medical, you can't release, there's regulations against releasing, being transparent about releasing medical data. How should companies think about that trade-off of when this actually would be more transparent but could cause harm to any particular group of people or entities?
Yeah, I think that's a fair question. And my perspective is I don't think to be transparent, a company needs to outline all of their, or at least release all of their training data. But I think explaining where it came from, perhaps what it's missing, what its gaps are, as well as like which pieces are most important in the model would be a more transparent way of making sure that users are aware of how the model is built and what inputs it has, and how they're weighted. But I agree. I think in most cases, a company wouldn't want to release sensitive training data or even just raw training data.
Does that open them up, though, to sort of the question that's happened before, which is, if I give you my weights and measures and I give you my methodology, I no longer have trade secrets at all other than the data? Does it, hurt differentiate, your status as a differentiated product in a marketplace?
My perspective is no. I think a lot of these companies are already open sourced, so I don't think that's something that they're concerned with, first of all. And then I do think, like going back to the idea of garbage in, garbage out, like I think the data is probably more valuable than perhaps the weights or the way that a model is fine-tuned. I'm sure there is a scenario where like a company would be concerned with that, and in that case, maybe the transparent way to reach users without reaching competitors is to qualitatively describe the weights. Awesome. Thank you.